we move on to distinguished lectures, and we have two distinguished lectures here. The first is Metaphor Awareness for Multidimensional Practice, a proposal for enriching narrative mediation with expanded metaphor techniques. And the presenter is Rachel Goldberg, Ph.D. from DePaul University, Greencastle, Indiana.
So, hi, I'm Rachel Goldberg. I'm going to be talking about multidimensional conflict resolution. I just published this book. I'll be sending it around so you can see a copy. If you want to buy a copy, I have little forms that you can send to the publishers. I'm very excited about it. So, basically, I'm going to talk a little bit about this idea of what I'm calling multidimensional conflict resolution. So, years ago, I was called to this work with colleagues of mine because of many aspects of my personality, including my picture of a universe that had transcendence in it. And I found very early on in my practice of conflict resolution that I was being asked to cut those parts of myself off. And being a good dutiful graduate student, I did that and found some real limitations in what I could do. At the same time, there were increasing critiques in the field about neutrality and the limits and problems of that idea of perfect neutrality that we had in the field that we inherited from the legal system. And our work, my work, started to really critique that. And I did some of the first empirical research in the field, showing very clearly that the values of the practitioner shape their practices. So, sorry, get over it, folks, you're not neutral. And it's okay, right? Our goal is not to be perfect neutrals. Our goal is to assiduously and powerfully protect the self-determination of parties, right? That's what we're about, helping people solve their own conflicts. And we can do that, my contention is, while bringing our full selves into the process. So that's multidimensional conflict, and that's a Picasso painting because it's trying to show the multidimensional nature of, a face in a one-dimensional medium. All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about the model and a little bit about tools. I had an exercise with intake and outtake, and I will ask Basil as we go through whether I have time for that or not. Okay, this is me. Generally speaking, at a conference, I feel like it's a good idea to let people know I didn't fall off the conflict resolution truck yesterday. So I've been a mediator for over 25 years. I'm a scholar, practitioner, teacher, trainer, professor. I'm supervisor of the Restorative Justice Program and associate professor at DePaul University. And I'm now director of my program. And I also have my own small consulting business. So that's just a little bit about me. I wanted to sort of get a quickie sense of the knowledge in the room as well, just so I sort of know who I'm talking to. How many folks in the room are conflict resolution practitioners? Okay. Teachers, trainers, students? Okay. Other? Can you guys just tell me a little bit of what the other is? What? Lawyer. Others?
I call it priest.
Beautiful. Okay.
Spiritual healer and artist.
Also beautiful.
Social work.
I direct a court program.
Court-related mediation program or just?
Court mediation program.
Awesome. Okay, great. Thank you. All right. I just didn't want to be using lots of language which wouldn't work or was totally off track, so I just kind of wanted to get a sense of who's in the room. Okay. As you can tell, I'm going to go over a lot in a short period of time, so I'm going to be filling your brain like this poor little kid. If you say, please, my brain is full, or you have a question, please stop me and ask a question. So I wanted to do this quick exercise. Do we have time for a quick exercise? Okay. So what I want to do is for this multidimensional practice, right now I'm trying to shift. The book was me sort of saying, hey, wouldn't it be cool if we could bring our whole selves to this work? Wouldn't it be great if we could respect the whole selves of parties? Books published, next step is to try and do this in the real world. So So I'm looking for a practice location for my sabbatical, either a group organization or community that would like to have somebody, senior mediator, come in, train a mediation center, start a mediation center for you for free, let me know.
Magic word.
Free, man, free. Not coming in to make a profit, although, of course, it's good for my career to get things published, so I suppose there is a profit over there on some level. But at any rate, I want this to go somewhere where people can use it. Ideally, a community or a group of people for whom the idea of multidimensional practice isn't wacko. Like the idea that they, for instance, I'm talking to a synagogue, for whom it makes sense that your spirit, mind, heart, and body would be part of your conflict. So in order to try and think about how to train these mediators, I've started to develop some materials. This is an intake form, which I'm thinking of using in this practice, and I thought I would try it out here, see what you guys thought about it. So this is a real quickie deal. So can I ask you to find a partner? So I'll do that for a second. Grab a partner. I'm big on interactive. All right, anybody not have a partner? There we go, all right. Anybody still not have a partner? Awesome, okay. So, I tried to make an intake form that would be really simple and easy to understand, including people for whom English isn't their first language. What I'm trying to do is have space for the mediator working with the parties to ask them about the multidimensional nature of your conflict. So like little graphics, right? What are you thinking? How are you feeling? How does your body feel? And the little infinity symbol to sort of get at, is there some aspect of transcendence here for you? Is your religion or spirituality impacted by this conflict? And of course, parties can say no, right? And then they don't feel whatever that quadrant in that is irrelevant to them. The other thing I'm asking people about is to pick a metaphor for their conflict. And the reason I'm doing that is because metaphors have power to help people see things in a complicated way. Do we need another form? Thank you so much. Oh, you're so smart. Thank you. Okay. And what I've noticed in working with students in metaphors is that there's people like me who like wake up thinking in metaphors, and there's lots of people for whom metaphors are really weird and their brain doesn't go there. So what I've done is I've created a deck of cards, a metaphor deck of cards, that has all different visual images that you could relate to a conflict. So I'm asking you guys to think of a conflict, think about if these quadrants would, relate to you, and also come up with a metaphor. If you're struggling to come up with a metaphor, feel free to come up and look at the cards. The other thing I've learned about North Americans, which, is not necessarily this group, but for all I know may refer to folks in this room, is that in North America we suck at emotion words. So I have a little emoticon thing on the back. If you are somebody that doesn't have an easy time figuring out what your emotion is, this can help you pick some emotion words. So what I'm going to ask you to do with your partner is think of a conflict you were in that you had some energy about. It meant something to you. Doesn't have to be life crisis such that you don't want to tell somebody about it, but something that really mattered to you. And imagine yourself just for a minute back in that conflict and fill out this intake form as though you had just gone to see a mediator. So think about what you were thinking, often about the other people involved, what emotions you were feeling, what was happening in your body, if you can remember back to that at all, and if this impacted you spiritually in any way. So fill out the intake form and grab a metaphor. So I'm going to ask you to just think your way back into that conflict, take a couple minutes to fill this out, and then with your partner, talk a little bit about what's significant to you about that conflict in a multidimensional way as if they were your mediator. So just practice using this intake form is what I'm asking you to do, and then I'm going to ask you for feedback later to see if I should change it, if it sucks, if it's any good. But it's practicing this multidimensional aspect of the conflict from the beginning. So just take a minute with your partner, and again, you don't have to tell them about the details of your conflict if you don't want to. You can say, my heart was pounding, I felt betrayed, but you don't actually have to say, it was my brother-in-law, he slept with my wife, right? Okay?
Is it the same conflict?
No, you think of a conflict that matters to you as if he was your mediator. You think of a conflict that matters to you as if she was your mediator. Okay, so just take a couple minutes and try that out. Well, I'm lucky that I work at a teaching university, so we have really good friends. All right, I don't want to run too much into this gentleman's time, so I just wanted to stop and get a little bit of sense of how that went, how did it feel. I know you probably didn't get through the whole process. Any sense of the tool, feedback, thoughts?
I think some of the emotions or thoughts, whatever I had, I think can be added. And I thought this was helpful because I didn't see it. For example, stress, pressure to behave or not behave in a different way, and annoying.
So that was actually, that helped you remember more when you felt.
Right, exactly.
Cool, that's great feedback. Any other thoughts about this? Like, this is the first time any human being other than me has used this, like it could stop.
It reminds me of medicine.
Yeah. The roots of the work that I'm doing is based in logic indigenous processes.
Okay. It might be good to say that, based upon work on it.
I feel like I'd be lying because it's not enough based on it.
Well, I mean, the fact that the circle was there and it just makes as a suggestion when you said usually.
Oh, no, I mean this particular piece of paper.
Oh, okay, got it.
Oh, God, no. Circle thought, quarter by across, throughout this one.
Might be good.
Okay.
Basically.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
What do you think about it?
What? Oh, if you have trouble thinking of a metaphor. That's what the cards are. Okay, I have a feeling this was not the clearest exercise ever. So I'm going to go on with the presentation and see if the exercise makes more sense and then check in with you again. All right. So this book, which is circulating around in multidimensional practice, was an attempt to try and make explicit space for spirituality within mediation. And that is an idea that freaks a lot of people out. So I wanted to be clear about the arguments against and the way in which we responded to them. So the arguments against bringing spirituality in any explicit way into mediation is that it will damage the self-determination of parties, it undermines our ability to claim legitimacy as a field, values aren't negotiable, religion is a source of hate and intolerance, and some of the leftovers of Enlightenment thinking. So again, I'm going to race walk through this. I talked about self-determination, and in terms of neutrality, the idea is that we gain our neutrality, we gain our legitimacy as mediators by being objective, by separating mind, body, spirit, and emotions, and basically being in our heads. That's what makes us objective, trustworthy neutrals. The other argument is that values aren't negotiable and religion is used to foster war. However, there's been some really interesting thinking taking some of this stuff on. So I'm going to summarize a Jones and Hughes article. It's in the references at the end of the handout, talking about this Enlightenment thinking stuff. So a lot of this idea that we can't bring mind, spirit, body, and heart together comes from the Enlightenment. So Descartes was one of the guys that started us off on this idea, specifically objectivism, the idea that we can use reason to separate ourselves from our environment, and that's how you know the truth. If we take ourselves away from the body and emotions, we know the truth better because we're not being prejudiced by our mind and our bodies and our emotions. Similarly, reductionism was part of this. I think that is actually a drawing by Descartes of a duck. And this was inspired by the Industrial Revolution, the idea that we're all machines, that the pieces of any system can be broken down and then we'll understand the system perfectly. So our medical system was influenced heavily by this, which is why you got a spleen guy and a liver guy and a lung guy, and none of them talk to each other, as though all those things went together in the body. Determinism states that every cause has an effect. So to just summarize Enlightenment thinking, combined with objectivism and reductionism, it should always be possible to determine the cause of every phenomena by tearing it apart and analyzing those pieces in an objective and observer-independent manner. So the force, again, in the legal system and in mediation that says we should take bodies and spirits and emotions apart from brains comes from here. But guess what? That's not how it really works. Recent research in neurobiology of Homo sapiens tends to show us that the human mind is inherently embodied and no separate and objective reasoning facility exists. Most of our thought is unconscious, and we navigate our way through understanding abstract concepts largely through metaphors, and human systems are complex adaptive systems which are nonlinear, non-determinative, cause and effect aren't uniquely coupled, and integrated wholes which cannot be understood by breaking them down into any sort of essential elements. So one of the simplest ways to sort of get at this is when people have brain damage that affects their emotions, they can't reason. That brain damage means they're incoherent in their thinking. Our ability to be coherent is intimately connected to our feelings. Our feelings are inherently embodied. We are wholes, right? So for me, that's why I think we gotta act that way as mediators and support the reality that our parties are that way. So I'm gonna skip over this so we have plenty of time for him. I think I've made that argument. The only one that I wanna put in here, because this is always sort of tricky for mediators, this idea that we shouldn't be neutral. There's really strong evidence. Christina Raki's done beautiful research. She did research in a court-related mediation program that had Latino respondents and Anglo respondents and looked at patterns of what the outcome rates and the satisfaction rates were for both sets of respondents, also looked at gender, and what she found was that the communitarian norms of the Latino community meant that they tended to offer early concessions in a way that was interpreted by their Anglo counterpoints as a sign of weakness. And if you had two Anglo mediators or even one Anglo mediator, the powerful ideas of what negotiation looks like in our society meant that the Latino respondents didn't do as well. The only way they did as well is if they had two Latino mediators. So this idea that we're neutral when we're not is dangerous. We are acting out our biases and our culture and our values all the time. What we can do best to respond to that, I don't have this slide on here. We've learned a lot from the spiritually oriented psychotherapy literature is to understand our own biases. The more self-aware we are, the less we are likely to be damaging the self-determination of parties, and the better our boundaries are, the more we're protecting them. So if we really want to support the self-determination of parties, acting like we're neutral when we're not isn't actually the best thing for self-determination of parties. Okay, so that's that in a nutshell. So then I came up with this idea of multidimensional conflict. Two big ideas shaped the way we thought about it. Lederach's universal stages of conflict, which are not rooted in one cultural set of norms. or at least that was his attempt. And David Heiser's idea of mediation as a ritual. So those are, loosely speaking, letter acts, universal stages of conflict. And David Heiser talks about mediation as a ritual, thinking about the way in which we create space to separate people from regular life to another place, which is more liminal, where things can change and have a transition in there that they then incorporate when the change is reintegrated into normal life. So putting together this idea of mediation as a ritual that creates space for people to change with letter acts, universal ideas of conflict, we created a sort of way of thinking about how can we tell how multidimensional a conflict is. So this is just a little piece of our research. What we did is we looked at Ho'oponopono, which is a Hawaiian conflict resolution technique. I was not able to talk to Ho'oponopono practitioners, cause for very good reasons. They're tired about talking to white people, and I don't blame them. I did good research on it, and I did reach out to people who worked with Ho'oponopono kahunas, and there were some that were trying to talk to me, but we just never made it happen. So there's some gaps, right? So my guess would be that there's probably a very clear somatic element of Ho'oponopono, but I wasn't able to talk to a practitioner and get that information. So this is just a little comparison about sort of classic community mediation and Ho'oponopono, comparing cognitive, somatic, emotional, and spiritual aspects of the process. And as you can see, there are some differences, right? Classical mediation has some things it doesn't necessarily make space for. So that's the idea of multidimensional practice. To learn from practices like Ho'oponopono and think about what it would be like for us to do multidimensional practice. To make space for the spirituality, the emotions, the body, and the thinking of our parties in an explicit way without imposing our own beliefs or needs on them. So in your packet, there's some actual tools. I have more of them for those that are interested, but what I'm going to try and do when I develop this mediation center, or whoever wants it, so let me know if you think you know of a group or community who wants it, is to train mediators on somatic tools, emotional tools, spiritual tools, and cognitive tools that they can then use. So the idea is, may I borrow this for a second? You do intake and you find out, wow, these 3 quadrants are really important, this one isn't important. We've got tools in our tool bag for these 3 quadrants. Let's say to the parties, would this help? Would this help? Would this help? And they say yes or no. And ideally, in my worldview, you would develop those tools with that particular community, tailored for that community. Because the spiritual tools that are going to be useful at a synagogue aren't going to be useful at a Catholic church, right? So my goal is to sort of think about how you go into a particular community and ask them, what do you need? And work with them to develop those tool sets. So that their mediators then have all those tools and they can ask the questions such that they can respond to their parties in whatever ways those parties need. So again, I was going to do a little outtake thing where we go over the tools. My guess is we don't have time. We do have time? Okay. Just little tastes of tools in your packet. One of them, remember I said self-awareness and good boundaries is the best thing for mediators if we want to protect the self-determination of parties. So the thing I started out with is a self-awareness tool. Real simple, it's in your packet. It's just the idea of a spiritual autobiography. So this is a tool used in spiritually oriented psychotherapy where you just sit down and you journal, what's my life been like in terms of what I've learned spiritually. What has my religion or my spiritual orientation taught me throughout my life? And it can be, for instance, in my dad's case, right? My great-great-grandfather was a famous rabbi. So my dad grew up thinking, wow, organized Jewish religion is incredibly long, boring things in a language I don't understand, right? So if my dad did that spiritual autobiography, hopefully at the end of the day, he would realize as a mediator, when he's dealing with people for whom organized religion is important, he will get impatient and he won't want to listen to them. right? That's self-awareness. There are other people for whom their spiritual autobiography might show this transformation, deep faith that infuses their life with meaning. And again, they're going to have to be careful about ways in which they could impose that on parties by assuming that would be helpful for parties in the way it was helpful to them, right? The idea of a spiritual autobiography is know yourself. So you know the ways in which you could inappropriately impose your views on somebody else. The spiritual tools, there's a sheet there from Aiton and Leach, great book. It's a book that pulls together a lot of information on spiritually oriented psychology, and it's just a list of a whole bunch of research on different kinds of spiritual tools. There's also a little thing on how you could use change stories and rituals if you were working with a particular group. The idea being most religious traditions have powerful stories of change. You can draw on those stories that are meaningful for those groups of people that you're working with. You can also tailor and work with a ritual that will have meaning for that particular group. The public service announcement being, this stuff matters, take it seriously. Any kind of ritual you're trying to create has to be something that's appropriate and meaningful for the people that you're working with. And somatic tools. And I really want to just say a little bit about somatic tools. There was a study, I think in the 80s, called the ACE study, and I am now forgetting what that stands for.
Adverse
Childhood experiences. Kaiser Permanente and psychotherapists reached out to around 30,000 Kaiser Permanente members of the health insurance. Around 17,000 people said yes, big, giant study. And they agreed to fill out these questionnaires where they talked about things that happened to them in their life. And it was correlated with their health, right? Because Kaiser Permanente got to see what happened to these people's health through their lifetime. And you got to keep in mind, right, that these people were largely white, upper middle class, well-educated folks that were financially stable enough to be able to afford health insurance, right? This is a pretty privileged group. These folks showed that 2/3 of them had serious childhood trauma that was affecting them. So if you think about those percentages, right, and these were the like pretty protected privileged folks, and think about how many folks in this society alone are dealing with structural poverty, structural racism, structural oppression. We have a lot of traumatized people that we're going to be dealing with in our work. Folks, and I'm a survivor myself, who have trauma histories are easily triggered, and they trigger more rapidly and they come down more slowly. You can get triggered in 1/5 of a second in shunting yourself into your emotional brain. It takes 20 minutes to come back. When you're in that state, you're less creative, you're less good at problem solving. You know, we're going to be dealing with folks that are there a lot, and they're going to be crappy at conflict resolution when they're there. Really simple somatic tools can help you come back, right? Not rocket science. It's a physiological somatic thing, and you can send physiological somatic messages to your body saying, it's okay, we can handle this. There's 2 in your packet. I'm just going to give you the very simplest one. They talk about it from an Indonesian perspective, but it's used in a lot of different cultures, just finger holds, right? You have meridians that run, major meridians that run through each of your fingers. This is why kids suck their thumbs to comfort themselves. So just hang on to your thumb, and each of your fingers can help you bring yourself out of that triggered state. So what I was going to do, and again, this might not make any sense, you might want to just discuss it with your partner for a second, was say, imagine being in that conflict. Imagine working with a mediator that has some of these tools, and imagine if you might have thought any differently at the end of the conflict resolution process. And this might just be too abstract. So I would say just sort of take a couple minutes and talk to your partner about these ideas and see what you think. Does that make sense, or is this just as confusing as it was before? Makes sense, all right, go for it. Less obvious? Or you can I'm being given the time and I need to wrap up, so I'm just going to ask any feedback, any questions, any thoughts, ideas about whether this makes sense.
A lot of it makes great sense, and I'm so glad you brought it forward because the differences can sort of railroad any kind of negotiation, mediation that might have been on a track. If you know, but all of a sudden you go too far off on the left. That was, I appreciate it, thank you for that. But I do have, one of the things I noticed that when we talk, both of our issues stemmed like 20 years ago or longer. And it reminded me that where we are today mostly is a product of where we were. And you know, just to make sure that that is part of the mediation process. The other thing that I thought about is just a question. Let's just say I'm just gonna quickly go back to the developers. There's the developers and then the community people. And the community people and the developers, let's say they sit down in the beginning and you know, and they're at odds. Do they wait until the end? Because I think that if the mediation, if they meet the people that oppose their ideas, who may not really oppose them, maybe they just haven't even heard them. If they meet them along the way, then the adjustments, the true adjustments, can be made instead of at the end of the process. And that's all I'm saying. Just thoughts.
Earlier, we talked to each other as human beings about what everything is. My first thought about that is the community has to have a good background. So the more organized and powerful the community is, the more the developers are going to have a reason to sit down and show. Does that make sense?
I think the developers have to be organized. You see?
But they aren't necessarily organized to be in relationship.
Exactly. That's what I'm saying. They have to be, just like the community has to be organized to be in a relationship. Because the developers are organized because 10 years before they got here, there was a government plan for them to be there. So, okay.
Yes, maybe not exactly the best working, but I was following everything, especially the emphasis on self-determination helped me a lot, and neutrality. But it came to me like, at times you have to be in conflicts and situations in which, let's say, there is a lot of personality disorder, which even though you will try your best, there is some parts that never will come to the table, and it's not possible to deal with it in, I would say, unhealthy personalities or whatever. So how do you deal with those situations? I guess a bad question.
No, it's a great question. My students raise it all the time, and it's really important. First of all, mediation doesn't fix everything. There are cases where mediation is a bad idea. Second of all, it's very common for people to load a lot of other stuff from their life into this conflict. There's great examples of sort of artful work that's been done by people who realize folks need therapy and bring it in under a guise the parties can accept. So like colleagues of mine were working with these two very famous doctors that were head of this medical department at this like Ivy League university, and they were fighting and destroying the department. And of course they wouldn't do conflict resolution because they don't have any conflicts. But they wanted leadership development. Everybody wants to be a leader. So under the guise of leadership development, they brought in a therapist and figured out that one of the guys had giant sibling rivalry issues. And was able to basically get that guy the therapy he needed in order to dislodge that baggage from this conflict. So you sneak a therapist in.
I have a question. What are the factors which decide that the matter has to be solved on mediation based? You settle everything that's road to.
How do you know mediation?
Yeah.
There's a lot of context-specific things, sort of some generic things that may or may not be helpful. Is, do the parties have to live with each other afterwards, such that they've got a reason to sit down and do this tough emotional work? And is this a case where them making their own decisions instead of decisions being imposed by somebody else would be best?
And it is a mediator who decides this that has no to be decides to do mediation.
It should be the parties and the
Can be the
mediator.
parties, okay.
So the parties hopefully have some idea of what process will work best for them. If they come to me and they say, I want to win, I want to destroy this pastor, I say, yeah, I think you don't belong in mediation.
So then you decide.
Both.
Oh, yeah, he came with the decision, yes.
Sure, you and then you.
Just a quick question. So I'm in a master's program in negotiation and conflict resolution, and I'm aware of being aware of your biases and implicit biases, but spirituality is something that we haven't discussed.
I know, I'm aware.
On that and how that would play into mediation in a mediator.
So you're trying to think about how to be unbiased about your spirituality?
I'm just trying to understand where spirituality comes into. You mentioned spirituality, so I'm just trying to understand.
For me, the connection between spirituality and neutrality is this idea of self-awareness and good boundaries. So for me, I've learned a lot about how to do that well from spiritually oriented psychotherapy, who, if anything, have more vulnerable clients than we do, or people bringing themselves in a different level of vulnerability. So I feel like, you know, they have a lot to teach us. Does that make sense?
I'd like to congratulate you on the work done. It's very interesting. You've given us a pertinent exercise where you've asked us simple questions which require complex answers. I was talking to my partner about my bodily reaction. I said, well, I'm thinking if my body doesn't react all the time, you know, just to illustrate the complexity of the answers. I've never been involved in a mediation, but I do different sorts of mediation. And I'm asking you if the mediators possibly think of crises before talking about conflicts, because I personally believe that an accumulation of crises leads to conflicts. And a crisis needs the resolution of a problem. But if we don't resolve that crisis, and if an addition of crises lead to conflict, so is there, do you think of the differences between the two? Another very simple question is the
Why don't I get to feel that you don't ask simple questions?
the idea of metaphor.
Oh,
You know that it's
that's coming up. I'm doing a presentation on that in the afternoon. So, about the first question, I think we need to do much better trauma-informed work. And I think we need to understand how much unborn trauma there is and how poorly our society does at helping people recover from trauma. And I think our society, personally, I think could make no better investment than massive work, understanding and helping people do that. I think we would be trying to figure out a pathway to say this. Have less crazy political leaders. If we... I know, it doesn't really work out. If we were a more trauma, help heal society. I feel like I should wrap up. Okay. Thank you so much.